Bloody insolvency delay, why our elites need war.
brauchen. Gegen den
Against the current, getting to the point.
Pizzaschachteln. Das erste, was ihm auffiel,
Pizza boxes.
waren diese eingerissenen,
The first thing he noticed was the torn, greasy, half-open pizza boxes on the worn hallway carpet on the 5th floor of the Chelsea Cloisters apartment building on Sloane Avenue.
Sloane Avenue.
The driver from Psycho Cars Service had brought him there from Heathrow Airport in just under an hour.
Einstündiger Fahrt gebracht.
He checked in and threw his suitcase onto the bed, only to get back in the car right away, so he could edit his first report from London that very afternoon at the studio on Great Chapel Street.
Ersten Film aus
Petra and his colleagues on the home desk had put together a few amusing travel essentials for him in a package labeled Great Britain, last but not least.
in einer Packung mit der
They laughed warmly as they said goodbye, happy for the newly appointed correspondent.
Herzlich freute sich
And at the newsroom in Soho, he was welcomed with friendly smiles.
In Soho wurde mit freundlichem Lächeln empfangen. Der ruft hier nicht einfach an, so die Studioleiterin.
He doesn't just call here, the studio manager said jokingly. He writes me a letter. I like that. It was July 1st, 2003. The city was sweltering in blazing heat. Prime Minister Tony Blair was caught up in the worst crisis of his career, involving doctored intelligence documents that Downing Street had used to justify the illegal invasion of Iraq alongside the United States. And amid the treadmill of day-to-day news coverage, no one had time to wonder who might have carelessly tossed the emptied pizza boxes into the hallway.
Die leer gefressenen Pizzaschachteln achtlos in den Flur geworfen haben könnte. Zunächst dachte er auch nicht weiter über die zahlreichen langbeinigen jungen
At first, he gave no further thought to the many long-legged young women in short skirts who gathered in the lobby of the Chelsea Cloisters after dark, then slipped past the doorman one by one and onto Sloane Avenue. There, they got into sports coupes to, as he thought, take a quick spin around the block. Their broken English and the fragments of Russian or Ukrainian marked them as Ukrainian tourists. Apparently, the Cloisters had turned out to be an insider tip for them. Days later, he noticed the Lamborghini dealer at the South Kensington subway station. It carried only the newest models in yellow, red, and black as convertibles or sports coupes. And gradually it dawned on him that there had to be buyers for these luxury cars somewhere around Hyde Park.
diese Luxusautos rund den Hyde Park auch Käufer geben musste. Es war unglaublich viel Geld in der Stadt. Die Finanzindustrie
There was an unbelievable amount of money in the city. The financial industry kept creating new complex securities, collateralized debt obligations, often backed by junk real estate, credit default swaps, supposedly meant to insure against loan defaults, but really just bets. Bankers created money out of nothing and looked forward to new profits.
und freuten sich auf neue Gewinne. Schon bald
Soon after the war against Iraq, launched by Washington and London, oil from the desert sands would pour money into the pockets of the loan sharks in the financial district.
im Bankenviertel
New natural resources are the basis for leveraged derivatives trades and for new loans, promising new premiums and new interest income.
die neue Prämien und neue Zinseinnahmen versprachen. Wer weniger als 50.000 Pfund
Anyone who took home less than £50,000 a month in base salary, bonuses, and incentives from the glass towers of the banking district was considered a social case. The money disappeared into tax havens, luxury real estate, luxury cars, and the pockets of the girls who climbed into the passenger seat. They were the ones who, after work, sometimes ordered something from a pizza delivery service late at night, then tossed the cardboard box outside the hotel room door in exhaustion. Those were the scenes he could observe when, in the evening, he sat outside the Hourglass on Brompton Road and had another pint or two to come down from the nervous frenzy of the day-to-day film and news business.
tagesaktuellen Film- und Nachrichtengeschäfts. Premier Tony Blair war Dauerthema. Die
Prime Minister Tony Blair was a constant topic. The dodgy dossiers he used, with dirty tricks and lies about alleged weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, to drag the country into a war that was clearly a war for Iraqi oil. Oil that was then supposed to become the basis for new speculative deals and commodity futures contracts, new loans, and new investments. Not only did government scientist David Kelly, whom the BBC exposed as the source of information about the government's deception operation, have to die for the profits of the financial industry, so did the people of Iraq. But the bankers drove their convertibles out of the underground garage, picked up a companion, or disappeared into the nightclub across the street. The credit bubble kept growing until Iraq sank into civil war and chaos, and finally in 2008, the bubble burst. The City of London was, and still is, a state within a state.
Ein Staat im Staate. Seit Maggie Thatcher die Industrie abgeschafft hatte,
Ever since Maggie Thatcher dismantled industry to keep the working class down, the kingdom had made its money mainly in finance. The correspondent's office hardly reported at all on how the financial crisis was building up or where its causes lay. Its main concerns were the summer of the century, the Lady Diana fan club from Weizsäckheim in Lower Franconia, and of course Tony Blair's ongoing crisis. And if there was any time left, rooftop barbecues would get going in the warm evening air, like the public viewing events during the 2006 World Cup, when the beer flowed freely. On his way home from Soho, he could admire the branch office of diamond dealer De Beers on Piccadilly, a reminder of the real balance of power.
Eine Reminiszenz an die tatsächlichen Machtverhältnisse. In den Buchläden gestapelt lag der Roman von Monika.
Stacked in bookstores was Monica Ali's novel, Brick Lane. Nazneen is 19 when she leaves her small village in Bangladesh to marry a man she doesn't know, much older than she is, in London. Uneducated but intelligent, she quickly realizes that this man's grand dreams of prosperity and social advancement will never come true. Her own modest dreams, on the other hand, do come true. She learns English from her daughters, she finds work in a clothing factory, and in Razia, a courageous friend. When her husband decides to return to Bangladesh, and her lover Karim increasingly tries to force her into the ideal image of a Muslim woman, she frees herself from both of them and chooses a life in England.
Und entscheidet sich für ein Leben in England. In diesem Roman fand London zu sich selbst.
In this novel, London found itself, the city as a promise. Anyone who came here from the jungle of religious narrow-mindedness and cultural backwardness could carve out a path to freedom through their own efforts. London as a colorful, cosmopolitan, and tolerant capital. That was how people liked to see themselves. The setting was Brick Lane, the street where many poor immigrants from Bangladesh had learned what it meant to be British. 10 years later, he would meet a state secretary from Schleswig-Holstein, who at precisely that time had worked in risk management at Deutsche Bank in London, came to Kiel through the Green Party, and from 2012 to 2017, served there as a political appointee, first at the Finance Ministry, then at the State Chancellery.
Dann in der Staatskanzlei tätig war. Ich habe auf der Brick Lane gewohnt, ich weiß, was das heißt.
I lived on Brick Lane. I know what that means. He replied, I know Brick Lane. When I was there in 2003, what I mainly saw was yuppies. The mood immediately froze. Please ask precise questions. A middle-class kid who wanted to give himself the image of someone who had worked his way up. In 2024, he joined the Climate Neutrality Foundation. There, he continued advancing the climate change agenda pushed by the Rockefeller Foundation, through which it opens up new markets for finance capital. By the time Monica Ali published Brick Lane, the street had long since begun to become a hotspot for tourists and higher earners. One Friday evening, he drank 2 pints at Nellie Dean's pub on Dean Street, then headed east.
2 Pints und machte sich auf nach Osten. An diesem Sommerabend konnte sehen, wie die Brick Lane zum
On that summer evening, he could see how Brick Lane had become an alibi for a financial district that essentially wrote its own laws. In this extra-legal zone, bankers and law firms made sure that Ukrainian oligarchs could make their money disappear into shell companies and tax havens, while the bankers and their entourage spent their bonuses on Brick Lane at night. The street signs were still in Bengali, but the smell of curry was fading. The street between Bethnal Green to the north and Whitechapel to the south was beginning to be colonized by the financial district.
Begann vom Finanzdistrikt kolonisiert zu werden. Eines Nachts im August brauste an.
One night in August, he was speeding through the left side traffic of the empty city, drunk, with a friend in the friend's car. They were coming from a party, and he was behind the wheel, M recounts. I was once with a Russian woman here in London who ran an escort ring with women from Russia and Ukraine. She made a lot of money that way. She was simply looking for a man, not one who would support her. She was looking for one who would take her to expensive restaurants and to the opera, someone who would immerse himself with her in the atmosphere of a cultured, middle-class life. She literally dragged me away, and we were very happy together. We were planning a vacation in Spain. The night before we left, I got completely wasted. The next morning, the alarm tore me out of sleep. I was in terrible shape. I quickly threw a few things together, tossed them into a suitcase, and at Heathrow, she immediately smelled that I'd been drinking heavily and was nowhere near sober. While we were standing in line at the counter, I realized I'd forgotten my money, my credit cards, everything. She paid for everything for 2 weeks. She didn't say another word to me. And after the return flight, we went our separate ways without saying goodbye. That was my story about the Russian head of a call girl ring. He replied dryly, half serious and half joking, "You idiot." The U.S. State Department's Trafficking in Persons report counted as many as 800,000 victims of human trafficking worldwide in 2011. It noted matter-of-factly that the number of Ukrainian women forced into prostitution had continued to rise in 2010. The trade operates in an organized, routine way through networks. In 2003, the Home Office estimated the number of sex workers who had entered the country at around 4,000. In 2010, their number was estimated at 2,600. Thousands of women are funneled into the Europe-wide sex trade through Odessa alone. Some are forced into it. Some are lured with promises of office work and modeling jobs. Some see no other way to survive and desperately try to leave the city. About half of them come from the Odessa Oblast, where traffickers roam the villages and win girls over with stories of career opportunities and wealth. From Odessa, the trafficking is managed through a strict hierarchy of pimps, madams, and a cross-border mafia, shielded by corrupt police officers. The report also mentions the involvement of government members, a profitable business. After the Russian invasion began on February 24, 2022, many women were driven to flee and forced into the sex trade beyond Ukraine. The large-scale presence of Ukrainian recreational prostitutes traveling on tourist visas reflects the impoverishment of their home country. It is a process connected to the country's growing integration into Western economic circuits, in which Malta plays an important role. That is where Ukrainian oligarchs set up special-purpose companies and holding companies so they can shield the fortunes they plundered during the privatization of the economy from the reach of their own government in Kyiv. In London, the wandering capital of Ukrainian oligarchs found an attractive harbor. The City of London's administrative status helped make that possible. For centuries, it had its own administration, the City of London Corporation, its own mayor, the Lord Mayor of London, and its own police force. That allowed it to evade the reach of the government in Westminster. This makes the Lord Mayor the head of the world's most powerful financial lobby. His administration uses its wealth and status to push for deregulation of the financial industry, not just in London, but around the world. This is where the profits from the colonies of the British Empire ended up. This is where the king's wars were financed. This is where ways were devised to bypass state foreign exchange controls. As early as the 1950s, British financial institutions were accepting deposits in US dollars. Trading in foreign currencies was officially prohibited at the time, and they offered higher interest rates than US authorities allowed. This barely regulated, so-called Eurodollar market grew rapidly. By 1980, deposits had reached 500 billion US dollars.
1990 wurden fast 90% aller.
By 1990, nearly 90% of all international loans were being issued through it. At the same time, London banks maintained close ties with the remnants of the empire: the Cayman Islands, the Bahamas, the Turks and Caicos Islands, the British Virgin Islands, the Channel Islands, and Malta. Malta thus became a transit hub into the City of London. Ukrainian assets moved into Western tax havens, which in turn encouraged capital flight. This is where the city's offshore strategy began, attracting money while making it disappear from the tax authorities. To this day, the city's square mile is a magnet for tax-evading money from around the world. This is not about sustainable investment. It is about quick profits.
Sondern schnelle Gewinne. Dieser Casino-Wirtschaft verhalf Premierministerin Margaret.
This casino-style economy helped Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher break through after her election in 1979. Currency controls were lifted, the pound rose, exports became more expensive, and 1/5 of industrial jobs disappeared, while the financial sector ballooned. In 2024, 400,000 bankers, brokers, and insurance employees crowded in here on weekdays, generating 8% of Britain's economic output. Financial whizzes invented credit derivatives, securitized securities, and entered into every kind of futures deal to make even more money from money. The high salaries and bonuses pulled other sectors into the boom, including real estate, hospitality, and call girl rings. But at the same time, they widened the gap between rich and poor in the city. The city has a very particular form of democracy. The banks based there are allowed to vote as well, according to their number of employees. Lots of employees mean lots of votes, so the corporations always have the majority. The representatives become lobbyists for the financial industry, and big money gets a smoothly polished façade of democracy. Then came another decisive step. In October 1986, the British Parliament passed a law known as the Big Bang, a liberation for big money. It removed further controls and drew U.S. bankers to the city. In the 1990s, the collapse of the Eastern Bloc freed capitalists in the West from a possible alternative. The oligarchs' privatization spoils transferred former public assets into private hands and flooded the city with fresh billions. The winners of Eastern Europe's transformation brought it in. The money came from their plundering in their countries of origin, where the population was impoverished and forced to foot the bill. That corresponded to the European Union's business model. Simply bribing corrupt oligarchs and national elites with economic power, especially in Ukraine and Moldova, in order to turn those countries around and pull them into the financial circuits of Western capital markets. British banks also played a role in the theft of billions in public funds. Lax British legislation makes it easy to launder billions in stolen money and funnel it into the EU. Since then, this has ensured a steady flow of fresh capital for investment, while the resources of the target countries, oil, gas, rare earths, fertile black soils, steel mills, pipelines, ports, provide new collateral for new loans. But this comes at the expense of people in the EU's neighboring countries. Their public assets were privatized in a fire sale. Instead of investing, capital was taken out of the reach of their own state. Companies deteriorated or were shut down entirely. Wages often went unpaid, and many workers lost their jobs. They experienced the process of absolute impoverishment that Karl Marx describes. And now all that was left was to blame the bleak outcome on communist mismanagement. Families in eastern Ukraine went hungry. And while champagne corks were popping in London's financial district during the millennium years, entire regions were deindustrialized and workers were impoverished. All wars are bankers' wars, says financial analyst Alex Craner.
Sagt der Finanzanalyst Alex Craner. Die Töchter dieser Arbeiter in der Ukraine, das waren die.
The daughters of these workers in Ukraine were the ones who lived with me at Chelsea Cloisters on Sloane Avenue. They filled the clubs and the trendy bars. After dark, they climbed into the gleaming Lamborghini convertibles that the bankers kept in the underground garage and only brought out at night to drive a few laps around the block and pick up some blonde who barely understood English but did her job pretty well. And so, night after night, they stood in the lobby of Chelsea Cloisters in their short skirts. Women who, on a 1-month tourist visa, earned what they needed in Ukraine to support their lover in Kyiv, help their parents in the Dnipro, and pay for their grandparents' doctor's visit.
Und ihren Großeltern den Arztbesuch zu bezahlen. Alles Leute, die ihre Hoffnung einmal auf die EU gesetzt.
All of them were people who had once placed their hopes in the EU, and whom, after the 2014 Maidan coup, Galician Banderites could easily convince that the Russians were to blame for everything. Those in Moscow, or the Vatniks, the subhumans in eastern Ukraine, who would be best shot or driven out. Of course, tourist visas for his female roommates on Sloane Avenue did not just fall from the sky. The applications were submitted flawlessly and professionally at the British consulate in Kyiv. Processing was tightly organized. They needed people who spoke good English, who knew the application procedure, perhaps were already familiar with the consular officers, people who could advance the fee.
Für all das mussten die Mädchen aufkommen, oder sie konnten es.
The girls had to pay for all of it, or work it off afterward, with interest added, of course. For the time being, the idea of equality and fairness was thrown onto the trash heap of history. Bankers were seen as magicians, and the government anticipated the city's every wish. This applied especially to Tony Blair and New Labour. All the major parties in Westminster received donations from financial firms and individuals from the city. And of the 20 most generous Tory donors between 2010 and 2015, 8 made their money in the banking district. At least as important was the revolving door effect between government ministries and financial firms. Leading politicians, after leaving politics, took highly paid jobs at financial companies.
Für hochbezahlte Jobs in Finanzunternehmen an. Nachdem Tony Blair als Premierminister abtrat,
after stepping down as prime minister, Tony Blair took a part-time job as an advisor to the investment bank J.P. Morgan, with annual compensation estimated at between £500,000 and £2.5 million. In the city, the mood was celebratory. Take what you can get while you can get it. In the decade before the crisis, the financial sector grew twice as fast as the rest of the British economy, averaging 6% a year. With its concentration of commercial banks, investment funds, securities dealers, insurers, and reinsurers in the city, London had reclaimed its reputation as the world's leading financial center, ahead of Wall Street. No one, not even the government in Westminster, was willing to confront the negative consequences of an oversized financial sector.
Die Überbewertung des Pfundes nützt der City of London.
The overvaluation of the pound benefits the City of London because it is designed to attract wealthy investors from offshore jurisdictions, and they won't come if the pound loses value. But the strong exchange rate destroys the competitiveness of industry on international markets. It leads to bankruptcies and job losses, as well as a trade deficit. And so Britain has to attract money in order to balance its current account again. Everyone believed that breaking up and globally dispersing credit risks made the system safer because they wanted to believe it. While visiting Karl Marx's grave at Highgate Cemetery, the actual grave is far away from the memorial, in the back Jewish section of the cemetery, the Red-Green Coalition in Berlin also wanted to break up Germany Inc., thereby fueling financial capitalism.
Und heizte so den Finanzkapitalismus an. Die steuerliche Freistellung von Veräußerungsgewinnen im Jahr
The tax
2000
exemption for capital gains in 2002 allowed banks to sell off their industrial holdings tax-free and invest the proceeds in stock market speculation. This had two fatal consequences. First, German banks were quickly pulled into the whirlpool of the 2008 financial crisis, something they might partly have avoided without this shift. Second, the international financial industry was able to buy into German companies and thus influence management decisions. In London, in the spring of 2009, the winds of the financial crash swept human fates through the rain-soaked streets like empty beer cans. Bankers were no longer quite so free with their money, and the stock release parties were cancelled.
Die Aktien-Release-Partys fielen aus. Bei den Geschäftsessen sparte man sich die
At business dinners, they did without the mistresses, all of whom had one too many buttons undone on their blouses. In private, they gave up the whole routine and its excesses. Family was back in fashion, and the call girls were sent away to fend for themselves. The oligarchs got capitalism, football clubs like Roman Abramovich, golf courses, clubs, and salons. The girls from Ukraine got exploitation, collective guilt, and street prostitution, joined by more and more young women from South London. He himself was there when Polish construction workers broke into an empty apartment block on Jamaica Road with no heating or running water. They needed a roof over their heads and a place to sleep in London's rain and the icy cold of March. They had been fired overnight. The banking crash drove construction companies into bankruptcy. Suddenly, cranes stood still at construction sites. Wages that were still owed were no longer being paid, and those in the East End who had hoped to earn more in their coveralls than they could back home, as teachers or professors, simply didn't have the money for a flight back to Warsaw. In a pub in Brixton, he had to settle an argument because Poles and Brits, drunk, were about to go after each other and had already reached for chairs. Stop, guys, and cool down. You won't get a better life by fighting each other.
You won't get a better life with fighting each other. All this shit is about class, not about race.
All this shit is about class, not race. You can find decent men in any country. The banking crisis was passed down the line. Both Polish and British workers were drowning, and the anger that had long been sealed off in the day-to-day struggle for survival, the anger left behind by neoliberalism, by wage cuts, intensified workloads, layoffs, fear of personal failure, exhaustion, resignation, broke through most violently where the quake had caused the greatest damage. Among the British people at the table, the suppressed rage left behind by neoliberalism had long since been redirected into a racist reflex. The last thing these people, battered by capitalism, needed was lectures on diversity or lessons about the climate. But they were receptive to reason and respect. And above all, they didn't want to embarrass themselves in front of a foreigner, least of all a German. Did you hear that, gentlemen? Friends, I think he's right. Let's stay friends and have another pint. With taxpayers' money, governments rescued the banks.
Mit dem Geld des Steuerzahlers retteten die Regierungen die Banken mehr als 1 Billion Pfund, also 1.000 Milliarden.
Since 2007, the British government has spent more than £1 trillion, that is 1,000 billion, on bank bailouts. But the recession that followed was even more costly. The economy shrank by 10 to 15%. Jobs were lost, debt rose dramatically, and cuts followed in social services and education. Once again, the financial industry had won. The financial crisis brought two decisive structural changes to the financial system. First, it shifted bad loans into government bonds. Second, it moved those bonds away from banks and into the shadow banking system.
Bonds weg von den Banken ins Schattenbankensystem. Die Rettung der Banken mit dem Geld der Steuerzahler hat
The bailout of banks with taxpayers' money has, according to the Bank for International Settlements in Basel, reduced risks in the banking sector. At the same time, however, government debt has risen to levels never seen before in peacetime. Meanwhile, fund assets have moved out of bank balance sheets while rising dramatically at hedge funds, investment funds, pension funds, insurance companies, and financial investors. This increases the risks because in the shadow banking system, investments are often leveraged through derivatives mechanisms in order to make the most of price fluctuations while also reducing the burden on equity capital. That raises the risk of procyclical fire sales and can destabilize the conditions under which governments refinance themselves.
Und kann die staatlichen Refinanzierungsbedingungen erschüttern. So ist auch der Haushalt Deutschlands in die babylonische Gefangenschaft.
Germany's budget, too, has fallen into the Babylonian captivity of international financial investors in the largely unregulated shadow banking system. They are making billions from the war in Ukraine, and they can pressure any country that wants to leave the ranks of the warmongers by selling off its bonds. The budget shortfalls that emerged after the financial system's meltdown served as a welcome excuse to further dismantle the welfare state. Faced with the choice of saving the financial sector or the welfare state, the government left no doubt that the city takes priority. In doing so, it signaled to the whole world that foreign money is safe here. The financial industry had to be kept alive, even if the rest of the world sank into chaos, misery, and war.
Elend und Krieg versank. Seit mehr als 3 Jahrhunderten finanziert die City of London.
For more than 3 centuries, the City of London has financed wars and sold insurance against the destruction they cause. In doing so, this financial center uses the resulting chaos as a weapon. Lloyd's of London is the insurance pillar of the city's financial control network. It is not actually an insurance company, but a corporation that functions as a marketplace, where multiple backers, organized into syndicates, come together to pool and spread risk. Lloyd's has a reputation for always paying out, but that comes at a price. In 1898, the company formalized a long-standing practice by introducing the free of capture and seizure clause. It removed war risks from insurance policies, creating the opportunity to charge inflated premiums when a conflict broke out.
Bei Ausbruch eines Konflikts überhöhte Prämien zu verlangen. Diese Klausel wurde im Ersten und im Zweiten Weltkrieg.
This clause was invoked during World War I and World War II, with the start of the civil war in the Donbas and Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014, after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, and after the U.S. and Israeli attack on Iran. In 1999, almost the entire world was opened up to unregulated derivatives trading. That meant government bonds, oil flows, shipping routes, and war risk insurance could be broken down into credit default swaps, hedges, and other derivative products, and thus made into objects of speculation. The decisive lever was the World Trade Organization's 1997 Agreement on Financial Services, the fifth protocol to the General Agreement on Trade and Services, which entered into force in 1999.
General Agreement on Trade Services, das 1999 in Kraft trat. Danach mussten alle 156 Staaten.
After that, all 156 member states of the WTO had to abolish the separation between commercial banks and investment banks that speculated in derivatives. The WTO agreement became a battering ram for opening global markets to this derivatives business. Derivatives trading then exploded and developed into one of the world's most concentrated and profitable businesses. It is controlled by a few major banks. In the City of London, the machinery of war insurance and the machinery of derivatives work hand in hand. The former drives up the premiums for chaos, while the latter reaps them through rehypothecation and legal seizure.
Die Absicherung der Kriegsrisiken ist eine Form der Versicherung.
Insuring against war risks is one form of insurance, but the derivatives market is a much larger insurance trap, because derivatives are sold as protection against market risks. In reality, they are a speculative gamble that skims profits from all major economic flows. In June 2025, the notional value of outstanding over-the-counter derivatives was estimated at $846 trillion, 16% more than the year before. That is nearly $1 quadrillion, a 1 followed by 15 zeros. As early as 2016, the volume of transactions in financial markets exceeded revenues from goods and services by more than 100-fold. If this bubble bursts, it will trigger a wave of insolvencies, forcing the fire sale of liquid assets.
Die den Notverkauf liquider Vermögenswerte erzwingt. Der Börseninsider David Rogers Webb dokumentierte
Stock market insider David Rogers Webb documented legal mechanisms that allow derivatives traders to claim everything for themselves. Quiet changes to the Uniform Commercial Code and corresponding EU regulations have turned ordinary investors into mere claimants. They have only a legal claim against their securities brokers, while, in any insolvency, stocks, bonds, and deposits are legally treated as collateral for the derivatives complex. Collateral that has been pledged onward multiple times. If the derivatives collateral fails, the house of cards built on that repledged collateral collapses. Margin calls and demands for additional collateral will follow. The chain of priorities for access is triggered, and the great raid begins.
Ausgelöst und der große Raubzug beginnt. Es wäre die Kernschmelze im Finanzsystem.
It would be a meltdown of the financial system. To prevent that from happening, more and more collateral has to be pumped into the system. Oil and gas reserves, rare earths, coal and iron ore, minerals of every kind. These can serve as objects of speculation for future profits, and thus as a new basis for derivatives trading. At the beginning of 2013, the then Dutch Prime Minister and later NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte signed a contract with Shell and the Ukrainian government. It allowed the energy giant to extract shale gas across an area of nearly 8,000 square kilometers in the region between Kharkiv and Donetsk. The energy multinationals Chevron and Exxon had also signed such extraction agreements.
Hatten solche Förderverträge unterzeichnet. Insgesamt hatten die drei Unternehmen Investitionen in Höhe von
Overall, the three companies had pledged investments totaling $32 billion, which already suggests the profits they expected. A consortium consisting of Exxon, OMV Petrom, and the Ukrainian state-owned company Naftogaz alone planned to invest up to $12 billion in developing the largest deposit by area in the Skifska oil and gas field in the Black Sea. Friedrich Merz, as CEO of BlackRock in Germany, apparently made similar arrangements for the financial sector. The Donbas is rich in natural resources, including hard coal, iron ore, and important minerals such as lithium, manganese, titanium, cobalt, rare earths, graphite, and other metals that are crucial for the energy transition.
Anderen Metallen, die für die Energiewende entscheidend sind. 95% der ukrainischen Energieressourcen.
95% of Ukraine's energy resources are located in the Donbas. These resources are a major incentive for the war. Shell, Exxon, Halliburton, and Chevron wanted to extract these resources using fracking technology and export them to the EU. In 2014, U.S. Senator John McCain appeared during the coup on the Maidan. In 2008, the major energy companies had supported his election campaign with a total of $2 million. And in return, McCain voted in the Senate against support for renewable energy and against higher taxes on oil companies. That saved the big energy complex about $13 billion in fiscal costs.
In May 2014,
In May 2014, Ukraine's largest private energy company, Burisma Holdings, appointed Hunter Biden, the son of U.S. Vice President Joe Biden, to its board of directors. A few weeks earlier, former Polish Prime Minister Aleksander Kwaśniewski and Devon Archer, the campaign manager of the future U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry, had already joined the board. At the end of April 2014, 4 weeks before his son joined Burisma, Joe Biden had visited Kyiv. He spoke with the coup government about Ukraine's energy supply and pledged to support the country in implementing the agreements concluded in 2013. But the companies had reckoned without their host.
Doch die Unternehmen hatten die Rechnung ohne den Wirt gemacht. Ausgerechnet die an Gas reichen Regionen Krim und Ost.
Ironically, it was the gas-rich regions of Crimea and eastern Ukraine that resisted the 2014 coup on the Maidan. In Donbas, the ousted President Yanukovych had received more than 90% of the vote in the 2010 elections. The population did not want to accept the violent change of regime. And in Crimea, 96.777% voted in a referendum to return to Russia. At all the access points to the Yuzivska gas field, in Sloviansk, Kramatorsk, Volnovakha, Lysychansk, and Rubizhne, citizens occupied city halls and blocked transportation routes. Within just a few weeks, the production region had turned into a civil war zone.
Die Rebellion im Donbas nahm westlichen Konzernen und
The rebellion in Donbas deprived Western corporations and banks of the opportunity to turn natural resources into their own collateral. On April 30th, 2014, the International Monetary Fund approved a $17 billion aid package. Kiev's Western sponsors pressured the new government to take action against the uprising and regain control in the east and south. A report by the U.S. network CNBC tells us that Kiev's actions were politically driven by major shareholders in the International Monetary Fund in order to support the Yatsenyuk government in its reform efforts.
Der Internationale Währungsfonds drohte,
the International Monetary Fund warned that if the central government lost control of the East, the aid program would have to be redesigned. On March 13, 2014, not only the army but also the 60,000-strong National Guard was mobilized, under the new security chief, the militant far-right extremist Andrei Parubi. CIA Director John Brennan personally organized, from Kiev, the deployment of dozens of CIA and FBI special units to establish a security structure against the insurgents. The coup government also intended to use military means to push through fracking for gas.
Auch die Fracking-Gasförderung durchsetzen. Die US-Außenpolitik hatte die Offensive der Energiekonzerne.
U.S. foreign policy had been preparing the energy companies' push into Eastern Europe since 2010 through the Global Shale Gas Initiative. This is a diplomatic royal flush, said David Goldwyn, the head and coordinator for international energy affairs. He recommended that Washington promote access to new exploration areas in order to secure investment. The goal was to integrate energy resources into the Western Hemisphere, reduce dependence on Russian gas in Ukraine and Europe, and thereby achieve a geopolitical shift in power. The energy partnership between Germany and Russia was identified as the central obstacle.
Zwischen Deutschland und Russland identifiziert. In einem vertraulichen Papier der Rand Corporation vom Januar.
A confidential Rand Corporation paper from January 2022, whose authenticity was, of course, immediately denied again, states quite clearly that the U.S. economy, and especially its banking system, cannot function without an inflow of financial and material resources from external sources. To ensure a transfer of resources from Europe to the United States, an economic crisis would have to be brought about in Germany. To do that, the low-cost supply of Russian energy would have to be cut off, and the only viable way would be to draw Germany into a war in Ukraine.
In einen Krieg in der Ukraine hineinzuziehen. Beim Krieg in der Ukraine ging es
From the very beginning, the war in Ukraine was about pushing the Russian competitor out of the energy market and generating new profits. This was urgently needed because the companies had financed investments in new extraction technologies through high-interest loans. Investment bank J.P. Morgan estimates the financial bubble around the fracking industry at around $550 billion US. If these high-risk bonds default, there is a risk of a scenario similar to the default on mortgage loans at the start of the 2008 financial crisis. That means profits from fracking exports had to be generated urgently, and new loan collateral had to be secured.
Genau darum geht es auch im Ukraine-Krieg.
That is exactly what the war in Ukraine is about. It was also what the illegal war against Iraq was about in 2003. And it will be what the attack on Iran in 2026 is about. Taking possession of resources, forcing markets open, controlling logistics routes, gaining new collateral for new loans, and leveraging profits in derivatives trading. One of the key shareholders mentioned by CNBC was reportedly Ariane de Rothschild, CEO of the Edmond de Rothschild Group. On March 18, 2014, she wrote to Jeffrey Epstein, "Hi Jeff, I served on the bank's executive board for a long time. The numbers are good, but they are not satisfactory to me.
Die Zahlen sind gut, aber für mich nicht befriedigend. Ich setze sie unter Druck, sich bei der Restrukturierung der
I'm putting pressure on them to come up with more when it comes to restructuring the asset management funds. I'm at a dinner with a client and I've had enough. I miss our conversations and hope you're well. I'll be home tomorrow evening. Do you have time? And let's talk about Ukraine." Epstein replied, "The upheavals in Ukraine are opening up many opportunities, very many. In fact, given Ukraine's liquid collateral, estimated at 10 to 12 trillion US dollars, one can speak of major opportunities, and of the collapse of the financial system if that collateral fails to materialize. It began with greed for new profits and a pincer movement to secure new collateral for the speculators.
Angriff auf neue Sicherheiten für die Spekulanten. Der Putsch in Kiew 2014 und der Angriff der Junta auf die
The coup in Kiev in 2014 and the junta's attack on the population in eastern and southern Ukraine were supposed to provide that security. This created the conflict that led to a full-scale war with Russia, and that could expand into another devastating world war in Europe. All wars are bankers' wars. They did not get the minerals in eastern Ukraine, so they cannot go back. They want the war. There is no story without the scene of the crime where it was committed. London in 2003 was the analytical test case, in which time and space stretched. He had to admit that it had only really struck him when the financial crisis of 2008 caused the house of cards built on dubious speculation to collapse, and when the first blood was shed in Ukraine in February 2014.
In der Ukraine das erste Blut floss. Der Sommer neigte sich schon fast zum Herbst.
Summer was already beginning to turn toward fall. At the end of August, he said goodbye to the studio on Great Chapel Street and to the building behind the railings. It had long since disappeared, forced to make way for subway construction and real estate speculation. The news machine had spat him out again. It kept running with others, ever more polished young talent producing films and live segments as if on an assembly line, all hoping for the big career. He took one last walk through Covent Garden and onto Brick Lane. Then he ordered lunch in Chinatown, had a drink at the Hourglass at dusk, and read the ad for Spitfire beer on the bar mat. "Ref, watch the Germans. They always want to nick some extra yards. Referee, keep an eye on the Germans."
Schiri, pass auf die Deutschen auf. Die wollen immer noch ein paar Yards heraustricksen.
They still want to trick their way into gaining a few yards. The joking warning to the referee about the German threat in soccer played on long-term memories of the Battle of Britain and the bombing of London at night. Memories that are being revived today, with a chancellor who wants to make the Bundeswehr the strongest conventional army in Europe. London remained caught up in the fever of stock market bets, involving the fortunes of Ukrainian oligarchs as well. And those who had been robbed chased after their stolen money, getting into their sports cars outside Chelsea clubs at dusk, and exhausted, throwing pizza boxes into the hallway at night. The great rip-off was underway.
Es lief die große Abzocke. Der Casino-Kapitalismus saugte immer schneller, immer mehr.
Casino capitalism devoured more and more resources, ever faster. A pyramid scheme meant to save old, bad loans and shady stock market bets with new collateral. War, a gigantic laundering machine that washes the citizens' stolen money over mountains of corpses into the accounts of corporations and financial investors. Iraq in 2003, Libya and Syria in 2008, Ukraine in 2014, Iran in 2025 and 2026. The merchants of death have to want war so that the house of cards made of derivatives does not collapse. One single bloody postponement of bankruptcy, the road to the final catastrophe of the capitalist system. London was the gateway to hell, and he had not even noticed. He took a taxi from Sloane Avenue to Heathrow and did not look back. It was a wonderful summer.
Sloane Avenue nach Heathrow und schaute nicht zurück. Es war ein wunderbarer Sommer.